Hey everyone, Ethan here from WordTech, back with another video, and today we are looking at a very special laptop. In fact, in many ways, this is, at least at its time, the most powerful laptop ever, and in a lot of ways, kind of the most powerful for its generation ever made. Absolute monster of a machine here that I'm very excited to show you guys, and I'm not only going to be going over this machine in depth, but we are going to be taking it apart and taking a look inside so you can see some of the amazing things that we don't get to have anymore. Now, this is a bit of a follow-up to my previous video, which I'll put in the corner, of desktop replacement laptops being completely gone, and I just think they basically don't exist anymore in my opinion, and we're starting to see it dwindle even further. You know, we still have some large machines, blah. Go watch that video if you want to know a little bit more about that. But the point is, this in many ways is the last like true desktop replacement laptop ever made. So this is the Clevo P870 DM2. I think it's the NP9872-S from Sager, which, you know, they're the system integrator that takes the Clevo chassis and then rebrands it and actually assembles all the parts and stuff like that. And this one's been around for a very long time. In fact, I bought this, I think, almost 10 years ago, somewhere in that realm. I can't remember if it was 2016 or earlier, but I bought this back when I was in college, which is funny. But I used this laptop for a very long time myself, and then I actually sold it to a friend of mine, and then he has since given it back to me so I can make a special video on this. So shout out to him for letting me do this, because this is a really special machine, and I'm really excited to show you guys about it. So the first thing I want to do is actually go over the specifications, because that's kind of going to give you an idea of just how monsterly this machine was for the time. Now, this was back when the GTX 10 series graphics cards were out, so 1070, 1060, 1080, blah. And back then, those GPUs, this was the only time, I think, at all that NVIDIA did it, where the desktop and laptop GPUs were equivalent silicon. Now, it does not mean that they had the same power budgets, but a 1070 in a laptop was the same chip as a 1070 in a desktop at that time, which was a really big deal at the time. It also made it really easy in most ways to understand what you were actually purchasing, and you didn't have different like VRAM amounts for the 1070 mobile versus the regular 1070 and stuff like that. You also still had to pay attention to power budget, so that was a big deal. We did have laptops that had lower power budgets than the desktop chips, but that was the era that this was, so Intel 6th gen, stuff like that. Now, this unit here has a GTX 1070 in it. And what's really special about this laptop is that it runs it at the full fat wattage of the 1070 at the time. And you could also put a 1080 in it. There was no 1080 Ti made in the MXM 3.0 form factor that this uses for its GPUs, because yes, they are swappable. We'll get to more of that when we actually disassemble this thing. But what was really special here was not just that it was able to run a 1070 or 1080 at the full fat maximum wattage that you were able to get, you know, without overclocking and stuff. Although you could do some overclocking on these. The cooling system's a beast, which you'll also see inside. But this was really special because it also could house a second GPU. So you could run two 10 series GPUs in SLI in this machine. Two GTX 1080s at very close to full desktop performance, you know, where you're dealing with a little bit of more difficult cooling and stuff, so some of the boost speeds may not be as good, but we're talking very close to the full desktop performance, and you could have two of them in here in SLI, which was just amazing. Now, if I remember correctly, the SLI performance wasn't quite as good as SLI on desktop, because the SLI bridge, I think, is lower bandwidth for MXM at the time, and that was kind of the big limiting thing at the time for SLI before we had like the high bandwidth SLI bridges, and you know, now it's basically gone, unfortunately. But this thing had full, proper, upgradable GPUs, which was amazing. That was the other thing, is at the time, this still has a 1070 in it, but at the time, I had plans to buy a second 1070 or maybe even two 1080s, put them in here in SLI. I never ended up getting around to that by the time I was in a position where that made financial sense, because the MXM GPUs, while you could buy them, were about twice as expensive as the desktop equivalents. By that point in time, it just made sense to get a better laptop. So I never ended up going that path. But this thing's still a monster. It also has an Intel 6700K. So yes, that is a desktop socketable chip that you could also upgrade, which was super cool to see at the time. And, you know, back then we only had like 2 generations on a given socket, you know, especially with Intel's dominance at the time. They didn't like to allow people to continue to use the same socket. Thank goodness we have AMD making it so that that's possible now. It would have been really cool to see a machine like this with AMD sockets where you could potentially have like 4 generations of CPUs in your laptop. But yeah, full fat desktop socketed CPU. This also meant that it was easier to work on, and at the time, framework didn't exist, so in a lot of ways, these were about as repairable as a laptop could get. You still had your ThinkPads and stuff that were also up there, and obviously not as monstrous as this thing, but at the time, for gaming machines at least, this was basically as good as it got. And you could swap out the GPUs, you could swap out the CPU, you could swap out the motherboard, you could swap out the drives, which this supports two 2.5-inch hard drives, so you can have a lot of storage at the time on this machine. I can't remember if 8 terabyte 2.5-inch drives existed back then, but at least 4 terabytes did. So you could have 8 terabytes of storage in a single machine, which for 2016 timeframe was pretty nuts, actually. So that was awesome. It's a 1080p display, which was nothing super special at the time and also isn't now. We still see that sometimes, but it was 120 hertz, which is nice. There were a lot of gaming laptops at the time that still were around the 60 hertz range, so that was really cool. And what was so nice about this laptop, and part of the reason that I really want to talk about it is because I miss this, which, you know, more in the video that I made about desktop replacements being gone, about why I miss this. But this machine, because it had all desktop componentry, still can play AAA games today. Now, I'm not going to be going through benchmarks, but my buddy that is letting me use this, who now has a higher-end laptop, he actually has the one from my last video, you know, that's obviously a much more powerful laptop, even though it's a mobile 3080. But what was so impressive is that this, since it had a desktop 1070, was still relatively playable in a lot of AAA games today, right? And we're talking like, you know, the esportsy titles, but the harder ones to run, like Marvel Rivals and stuff, running quite well on it. Now, the hard drives really slowed down shader caching and other problems like that, so there were definitely some issues, don't get me wrong. But take a 1070 laptop that had a really restricted power budget from the same time frame, and you're not really playing anything on it at this point. Like it's weak. And even more so if you had 1080 or two 1080s in this machine. Newer games, a lot of them don't support SLI, but you get the point. You could have a desktop 1080 in here, which is also a monster. In fact, I know somebody that was gaming on a 1080 Ti until quite recently, like a year ago, and it was still performing quite well. Like, it was starting to get long, but, you know, it was getting there. I mean, it's the GOAT of all time, right? But still, yeah, just amazing that you had a machine that lasted as long as it did. And they were also built like tanks. I mean, you can tell this thing is an absolute monster, and being built so well made them last longer. The fans haven't gone out on it. The speakers still work, which are probably some of the best sounding speakers I've ever heard in a laptop. In fact, they probably are better sounding than the one that I mentioned in my last video about desktop replacements. So just incredible all-around machine. Absolute monster performance, and it had a monster power brick to go with it as well. Now, it didn't take 2 power bricks. Silicon wasn't consuming so much power at the time, so the other laptop had 2 power bricks, but it is as big as you could get at the time, a 330 watt. Now, this also supports, I think it's up to 64 gigs of RAM, which I believe is what I installed in it. I think I bought it with like 16 or something like that. Another example of something that you could upgrade in the machine, which was just incredible. So as you can see, just a monster of a machine here. Absolutely a beast, and I'm really excited to take this apart for you guys. So let's jump into that, and we'll go over what the internals look like. Alrighty, got the cover off. That took a moment, but look at this monster here. Oh my. This thing is it's just a thing of beauty to me. Like, it just kind of blows me away, to be honest. I absolutely love this. So you've got your battery here, which is not an easily hot swappable battery, but is a totally replaceable battery. Somehow still isn't swollen either, which is surprising to me because this thing's been plugged in for effectively its entire life. So I was not exactly expecting that. But yeah, this thing is just a monster. You've got 3 fans. Now, one of the things that makes it expensive to upgrade is, well, actually, before I even get into the upgrades, let's just go over exactly what we're seeing here. So right here, you've got the MXM board for the 1070. So that's this unit here. The 1070 in this system gets its own fan to cool it with its own set of 3 heat pipes and a heat sink at the back here. So that's the first GPU slot. Now, you've also got your second GPU slot that goes along with this. So this is the other MXM slot right here, and is absolutely just a amazing that you can have multiple GPUs in this machine. It's just incredible. Now, the GPU also has a hookup of a power connector here, and then you've got your 2 DIMMs here. I can't remember if this thing holds 4 DIMMs. Yeah, it must hold 4 DIMMs because those are only 8 gigs. And I can't remember. There might be 32. It might not be 64 in this. I may have been wrong in the earlier part of the video. But point is that there's 2 DIMMs here, and then I believe there's 2 DIMMs under the keyboard as well. You've got your subwoofer here. Now, up at the top here, you've got got your CPU. This is a socketed CPU. You can actually see the socket there, and I'll of course get some B-roll of all of this, but you got your socketed CPU up there. Then you've got its own 3 heat pipes and its own heat sink. So that's really cool to see. So you can upgrade the CPU. You can see that the cooling's a beast. Now, one thing that's really obvious as you take this unit apart is that there is quite a bit of empty space, even in areas that aren't upgradable. Like, of course, you expect this to have empty space, but like I can almost get my finger under the motherboard here, and there's not anything under there. And like the battery maybe could have been made bigger and stuff. And so that's one thing that we've definitely, you know, gotten better at, is making powerful laptops smaller. And in fact, my last video about desktop replacements in a lot of ways proved that. Now, I didn't take that thing completely apart for that video. I didn't want to damage it, and I've taken it apart so many times I didn't want to like risk breaking some of the clips and stuff like that. So I didn't take it apart again. I probably should have. But anyway, there's less empty space in that one. If I have a picture of that machine, I'll try and put that up on the screen now. But the point is, there is less empty space in that than there is in this. You can even see like these edges around here. There's empty space, right, all around the sides. So kind of interesting to see that. It's been a long time since I've taken this one apart, and man, this thing is beautiful. I just, what a piece of engineering, honestly. Up here you see this third fan, and this is what's really interesting, is in order to actually put another GPU in this, not only do you have to buy the GPU, which a 1080, I think back in 2016 or 2018, whenever I was really looking at the pricing, was somewhere in the realm of like $1,250, I think was the cost of it. So you're looking at $1,250 for just the GPU, but that doesn't include the fact that you need the power cable, you need the SLI cable, and you need the heatsink assembly with the heat pipes. So you can slot the GPU in here, but then you've actually got to attach that other heatsink up here at the top, which is why it's interesting that this has a fan here that looks like it's just blowing into nothing. Now, I'm sure this is helping with RAM cooling and other stuff, like more airflow, better, right? So no complaints there, but that's where the other actual heatsink goes, is underneath this metal shroud. In fact, I think it takes place of that metal shroud. I think you probably removed that metal shroud completely with it. I can't quite remember, but just incredible. And then yeah, over here you've got the tension screws on top of the CPU socket with the lever there. Just absolutely incredible piece of engineering. And then one thing that I'll take a little further apart here in this section of the video, before I even shoot extra B-roll, just to show you guys that at the time, M.2 was not a thing. And so what you had instead in a laptop of this size was two 2.5-inch drive slots. And what's so special about having two 2.5-inch drive slots is that this actually supports 11mm drives, so you could get the larger drives at the time. So it may have been 8 terabytes that you could get at the time. So the normal thickness of these is 6mm or something like that. Maybe it's 7, I can't quite remember. But you could put thicker drives in there, so you actually were capable of having a lot of storage in this chassis that you maybe otherwise wouldn't be able to have. So really cool to see that as well, since M.2 was not a thing at the time, at least not widespread enough for it to be in laptops and stuff. I do think that there was maybe some on this platform. I can't remember, but anyway, then you've also got the RAM here that was fully upgradable. I think you could do up to 16 gigs per slot, so you could do up to 64, I believe is what it was, even though mine is not 64, it's 32. So anyway, cool to see that, though. I really like seeing the hard drives. I'll also bring the chassis cover over here, because you can see this thing is pretty cool as well, in my opinion. You've got a lot of airflow, ventilation, and stuff like that. You can see the amount of just basically open on the back here, right, which is really cool. So anyway, just absolutely a beast. Editor Ethan here, and as goofy as it is, I completely forgot to go through and actually film an outro while editing this. So anyway, the outro is a black screen and me talking to the mic. Thank you everybody for watching. This was a very, very fun video to make, and I look forward to the next one.